Welcome to Face to Face. Here we discuss the hot issues for this year's two sessions, the most important annual meeting on China's political agenda. In this episode, we'll talk all things environmental, from biodiversity conservation to sustainable development. It's our honor to have Professor Li Xiuxiang, a deputy to the National People's Congress and director of Research Institute of Environment and Trade of the School of International Economics and Trade. We also have Mr. Terry Townsend, a British conservationist and fellow at the Paulson Institute, as our guests today. Your participation will help our viewers understand how China is striving for a balance between economic growth and environmental protection. So let's start with you, Professor Li. Jiangxi is located in the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River, the third longest river in the world, and has a forest coverage rate of more than 63%. So what role can Jiangxi play in protecting biodiversity?
Thank you very much for your question. Well, I hope the following views. I believe Jiangxi has made the following contributions. Number one, we have set up the Jiangxi model in striking a balance between human and nature. And biodiversity is the cornerstone of humanity. It's also an important indicator of environmental protection. Jiangxi province is the ecological barrier for the lower reach of Yangtze River. It's also an important ecological barrier for the southern part of China. Across the province, we have a forest coverage of 63%, ranking second nationwide, and we have more than 2,400 rivers. We have a huge amount of water resources, and within Jiangxi, we have China's largest lake, and we are a member of the World Lake Conservation Association, and we are known for our Boyang Lake. The Boyang Lake is also located at the lower reach of the Yangtze River. It's a very important reservoir for the Yangtze River. Throughout the years, it has played a very important role of adjusting the flooding season. It has played a very important role as the ecological buffer of China. Over the years, it has a water resource amount that is larger than Yangtze River, Yellow River, and Huaihe River. And China is a very important country in terms of biodiversity. So I believe the ecological preservation in Jiangxi as well as in Boyang Lake is of great significance to the biodiversity in China. In Jiangxi, we have designated two different types of priority protection areas. These two mainly focus on wetland and also endangered species in a river. Two of the wetlands have been elevated to protection wetland at the global level.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so in the next question, I'm going to ask Mr. Townsend. So looking back at the history, developing a city is more often than not comes at the expense of the environment, like during the Industrial Revolution. So how can mega cities like Beijing and London balance economic growth and environmental protection, and how to maintain a sustainable development?
Well, thank you. This is a fundamental question that the world is grappling with right now. But we know that development is not sustainable if you don't look after the environment. So we know from recent research, for example, by the World Economic Forum, who found that 44 trillion of the global economy, that's around half of global GDP, is highly or moderately dependent on nature or the services it provides. And of course, ultimately, all economic activity depends on clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and a habitable climate. Now, in China, we saw decades of a relentless pursuit of economic growth with little consideration of the environment. And although GDP rose spectacularly through this period, this growth also resulted in hidden costs that are not reflected in GDP figures, such as air, water, and soil pollution. And of course, all of these have large costs to public health and to the environment. But in recent years, the government has taken a more balanced approach with a greater emphasis on the quality of economic growth, recognizing that you cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy environment. And I think this is the essence of the concept of eco-civilization, which China has been promoting over the past few years. And I think on cities specifically, it's easy for urban residents like us in Beijing or other major cities to think that humans are somehow separate or apart from nature. But the reality is that we are one species in a complex ecosystem, and we are dependent on all of the other species of plant and animal around us. For example, insects, bats and birds, they pollinate our crops that provide the food that we eat. Plants provide more than half of the medicines that treat us for various diseases. And of course, forests regulate our climate. So I see two specific roles for cities on this agenda. The first is that recognizing that globally about 68% of citizens will be living in cities by 2030. There's a key role in educating urban citizens in terms of our dependence on nature and to instill a respect for nature among city dwellers. And second, to ensure that urban planning and urban activities, and that's infrastructure development, transport, waste disposal, everything, all the activities within a city are consistent with the twin environmental crises that we face today in climate change and biodiversity loss. So in simple terms, that means ensuring that our cities are consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the forthcoming Kunming Agreement on biodiversity, which we hope will be concluded this year. So I would like to see every city in the world, including Beijing, London, every major city, set out plans to become zero carbon and nature positive.
Okay. Now, Professor Li, during last year's two sessions, you raised the idea of improving a comprehensive ecological compensation framework. So tell us more about that. Why is it so important? And what role will it play in the coexistence of humans and nature?
Thank you very much for your question. Last year at the two sessions, I actually submitted the proposal to improving the comprehensive ecological compensation framework. In China, we are actually doing very good in ecological compensation framework. There are a lot of pilot programs at different provinces and cities, but we are mainly focusing on water quality. The Ministry of Natural Resources in 2009 published a initial ecological compensation framework, but that framework still largely focuses on water quality. So there are a lot of loopholes and gaps. For example, let's talk about the Boyang Lake. We have a lot of migrant birds traveling here each and every year. They settle down here and they eat the fish from the ponds and lakes. And sometimes they eat the vegetables grown by the farmers and also the lotus roots and even some of the rice grown by farmers. So I believe the compensation framework should expand. We need to cover the damages brought by birds, and also we need to explore a much more diverse compensation framework. For example, if we are talking about the crop field, we can use one method, and if we are talking about other agricultural losses, we can try another compensation method. So if we could improve a comprehensive ecological compensation framework, we can strike a balance between humanity and nature. Thank you.
And Mr. Townsend, you co-authored a study on the global expenditure of nature conservation that's pretty groundbreaking. And you mentioned here that there is a global biodiversity financing gap. So, what does that mean for the protection of biodiversity, and how can we close that gap, of course?
Yeah, well, if we take a step back and look at what we're doing to nature, we'll see that we're currently in the midst of one of the greatest extinction events the planet has ever seen, and the first one to be driven by humans. So the populations of vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, and so on have fallen by an average of 68% since 1970. And if we continue on this path, we face a future where we could lose up to 50% of all species by 2050. And that's not just sad, it also poses tremendous risks to humans. So we know that our economy is highly dependent on nature. And as we lose species, we risk undermining our economies. And one tiny example is pollinators. So if we lose our pollinators, for example, the insects, the bats, and the birds that pollinate our crops, that would amount to a cost of more than 200 billion US dollars per year. And that's just one tiny service of nature. So in our Financing Nature study, we looked at an obvious question, which is why, if nature is so valuable, why are we losing it so fast? And the fundamental reason is that we don't value nature in our economies. And there's a growing consensus now that we should be treating natural capital, our natural assets, in the same way that we treat human capital, financial capital, and built capital, by investing in it and recording it in our national accounting systems as part of our national wealth. And as part of our research, we looked at how much is being spent globally on nature conservation and how much we should be spending to protect our most important natural capital. And we calculated that that gap was around 700 billion US dollars per year. That figure sounds large, and it is, but it's actually less than 1% of global GDP, and it's less than the world spends on soft drinks in a year. So we can afford it. And ultimately, the only way to fill this gap is to appropriately value nature in our economies. But as that's not going to happen overnight, we looked at how we can fill that gap today. And we found that the two most important ways to reduce that gap are the reform of harmful subsidies, and second, the inclusion of nature risk in investment decision making. So just very quickly on the first one, on harmful subsidies, it sounds crazy, and it is crazy, that for every dollar we invest on nature conservation worldwide, we're spending at least $4 incentivizing practices that are harmful to nature through subsidies to agriculture, fisheries, and forestry. So reform of those harmful subsidies is absolutely critical, and we can fill around half the gap simply doing that. Mm-hmm. And then the second element is investment risk. So that's about taking into account the impact on nature of investment decisions. So today, in most cases, there's no cost if you cut down a forest to build a farm or flood a valley to build a power station. But if we value nature appropriately, there would be a cost. And we know that business is very efficient at minimizing costs. So they would immediately seek the option that avoided or minimized any cost to nature. And of course, the full report goes into a lot more detail on how this can be done.
Right. And how can we do on the legal front to sort of improve our ability to protect the environment?
Yeah, so first I'd like to say this is an area where China has made significant advances in the last few years. We've seen a strengthening of a range of environmental laws, including environment protection law, the wildlife conservation law. There was a recent update to the list of species with special protection and with stronger penalties for those who harm these special species or their habitats. And of course, most recently, we saw the first law passed dedicated to the protection of wetlands, which is a really fantastic step forward. One of the most significant things, I think, in terms of enforcement is the introduction of public interest litigation. So this is a system under which prosecutors can challenge businesses and governments for violations of environmental laws. And this is a very welcome development. And we've seen cases in recent years that have highlighted and prevented potential environmental destruction that previously would have been unchecked. But in terms of how China can maybe do more, I would highlight 3 points. One's general and 2 are specific. The first general point is about resources and capacity building for enforcement, in particular in relation to wildlife-related crime. Law enforcement authorities need specialist training on wildlife crime. Identification of species can mean the difference between a small fine and a custodial sentence, and they need to have the resources to be proactive in undertaking patrols as a deterrent rather than simply being reactive to tip-offs. And then the two specific things, I think, first, the China's policy of ecological red lines, which is an innovative and groundbreaking policy that seeks to protect China's most important natural habitats. However, at the moment, there's no clear legal framework about how to enforce this policy. So although the red lines have been drawn, they've not yet been made public, and there's no legal instrument to help prosecutors enforce that policy. So transparency about those red lines and a clear legal framework are important to ensure the integrity and ultimately the success of the ecological red line policy. And then third, as a wildlife conservationist, it saddens me to see for sale on e-commerce platforms the traps and nets and other tools that are used for poaching. So, for example, mist nets, which are very fine nets used to catch birds, to catch wild birds, whether that's for the cage bird trade or for exotic food. These nets are so cheap and easily available online, and the only legitimate use of such nets is to catch birds for scientific research. So I believe it's a responsibility of e-commerce platforms to remove, or at very least restrict, the sale of items to legitimate users such as licensed academics. And because currently the sale of these items is effectively facilitating illegal activity. So, and removal of these items, it would barely dent their revenue of the e-commerce companies and would generate huge positive publicity, especially as China is hosting the UN Convention on Biodiversity later this
absolutely.
year. So,
yeah. So, Professor Li, let me ask you. So you've been dedicated to encouraging the public, especially young people, to learn and, of course, care about the environment. So you once suggested holding a bird watching festival in Jiangxi province. What are the challenges, though, to spread awareness of environmental protection? And of course, based on your observation, can you share with us some of the most effective approaches there, of course?
Well, there are a lot of effective approaches. I proposed to set up the Boyang Lake Bird Watching Festival because each and every year there are tens of thousands of birds migrating to Boyang Lake, and this year in particular we have witnessed more than 740,000 birds flying here. For the winter, for example, the white crane, 80% of the white cranes, they celebrate the winter here. And also we have the Oriental white-collared cranes. 50 and 60% of those birds, they spend the winter here. So truly, and the Boyang Lake has become a ideal place for a lot of the endangered birds. Boyang Lake has attracted a huge number of photographers and also birds experts. So that is why I think it's a great idea to hold the bird watching festival in Jiangxi province. And that is my suggestion, and I hope that we can truly establish this bird watching festival so that all the photographers and also the experts, they can come here and they can discuss how best to preserve those bird species. I frequently participate in some of the environmental protection activities. I hope that the general public can also get positively and actively engaged in Jiangxi province. Some farmers and ordinary citizens, they took the initiative to protect those migrant birds, and they also cured those injured migrant birds. I believe the public already has a very good awareness of ecological preservation, and there is still some gaps. For example, the public is lagging behind in terms of garbage sorting, and we still face some barriers. I believe that for environmental protection, we need to do the following. I believe we need to start from a young age. We need to engage in educational activities so that the children, they start to develop this idea from a very young age. And also we need to practice the rule of law in the field of ecological preservation, and we have to make sure that all those who violate the law are held accountable and punished by law.
Definitely.
And also, I believe those regions and jurisdictions and individuals who are doing very good in environmental protection, they have to be rewarded.
Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Townsend, you have lived and worked in Beijing for more than a decade, and you've suggested building Beijing into the city of biodiversity, which seems to be a pretty hard task here. Tell us more about your plan, and why do you think Beijing has the potential for that?
Yeah, well, I can sense the surprise in your voice when you ask me that question, and I think it's an interesting fact that a few months ago, for example, I asked my friends around the world what's the first word that comes into their head when they hear Beijing, and the most common response was pollution. And so Beijing has this image problem. But actually, there's another side to Beijing, which very few people know about, including many people who live here. And that is that Beijing actually has very rich biodiversity. So, for example, more than 500 different species of bird have been recorded in Beijing. Mm-hmm. And that ranks Beijing second in terms of G20 capital cities. So if you look at the capital cities of the major economies, Beijing ranks number 2
That's
behind only
news.
Brasilia. Yeah, so it's a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, but Beijing is much better than London, my home capital city, much better than Washington DC, Paris, Moscow, many other cities. It also has wild cats. There are very few capital cities in the world that have wild cats, but around Beijing you can find a small cat called the leopard cat, the bao mao, and around the mountains and the wetlands of Beijing. And Beijing also has more butterfly and dragonfly species than the whole of the UK. So it has a really strong foundation of biodiversity. And a lot of people say, well, why is Beijing so good? Because it's clearly not an environmental paradise. And so the main reason in terms of the bird diversity is that Beijing lies on this major, what we call a flyway, which is like a bird expressway. Mm-hmm. So millions of birds fly north in the spring to Russia, to Siberia, where there's very few people live there, but it's full of forests. And there's a huge explosion of insects in the northern summer. And so it's worth their while to fly there because they can then find food more quickly. It's protein rich. They can have more babies more quickly than if they stayed further south. But of course, in the winter, it gets extremely cold up in Siberia. So the vast majority of these birds must move south to avoid that cold and find food. And Beijing is like a service station on this expressway for birds. So some of those birds go as far as Australia, New Zealand, or even Africa. And so Beijing, it has a variety of habitats. We have some wetlands, we have some woodland, some big parks, and all of these places attract different types of bird. And so Beijing's role really is to help facilitate safe passage of these birds by providing that mixed habitat that can provide safe haven for these birds. So this biodiversity that Beijing has is something that we should be celebrating. That it's a huge asset to the city and something that can really help to change Beijing's image internationally, sort of from pollution to biodiversity. And of course, the first step is awareness. There's a very famous quote by a Senegalese conservationist who said, "Everyone wants to protect what they love, but they can only love what they know." And so the first step is knowing about this biodiversity. And then when people find out about it and they hear some of the stories of these incredible animals and birds live here, such as the Beijing swift, a bird that can fit in your hand, that breeds in the Summer Palace and other major tourist places around Beijing, that flies all the way to southern Africa for the winter. And even more remarkably is that they will fly there and come back the following spring without landing. And so when people hear these stories, they're like, wow, that's incredible. We must protect this bird. And so people fall in love with nature and then want to protect it. And of course, this builds support then for policies and measures that are needed to protect this biodiversity and the places that they need. So it's something that we can't take for granted. There are the current land management policies around Beijing. There's a heavy emphasis on tree planting. And of course, some biodiversity likes trees, but if we plant trees in the wrong places, for example, on grassland or wetland, then we're actually upsetting those ecosystems and maybe causing more harm than good. So I think if Beijing wants to be a capital of biodiversity, which I think it is very capable of being given this strong foundation, then it'd be great if they can come up with a sort of blueprint for biodiversity that just integrates biodiversity across all aspects of urban planning. And then I really believe Beijing could be the capital of biodiversity.
Okay, here's a question I want to ask both of you. So China hosted the COP15 in its southwest city of Kunming last year. So what's your take on China's efforts in biodiversity conservation so far, and what else do you think needs to be done?
The year 2021 marks the 28th year of the Convention on Biodiversity, and it also marks the 28th year of China's entry and signature to the Convention on Biodiversity. And China's former Ministry of Natural Resources signed the Convention on Biodiversity, and China was among one of the first countries to have signed the Convention on Biodiversity. In China, we have legislated the law on protection of wild animals, and we crack down on those illegal behaviors that hurt wild animals, and the harshest sentence could be a death sentence. So China has truly achieved a lot in protecting wild animals. If you look at the panda and also tigers in China, those are well-recognized achievements in the protection of wild animals. Going forward, China has to make continuous efforts. For example, we have to come up with more specific legislations under the framework of the Convention on Biodiversity. We need to improve our legislation framework. In this field, we already have a lot of laws, but we have to come up with more specific laws on the protection of biodiversity. In China, we have some pilot programs. We have to accelerate those programs so that we can truly make sure that there is a law when we need to abide by it. We need to make sure that there is a law when efforts must be made, and also in areas that are lagging behind in terms of economic development, we have to improve the governance capability of biodiversity preservation. We also need to cultivate better public awareness, and there is a lot of efforts to be made in this field. Also, we have to engage in international cooperation in biodiversity. We hope that the practice of China can be scaled up on a global scale so that it can be recognized, and there is mutual learning between different countries in this field so that together we can make some tangible progresses.
And Mr. Townsend, do you have anything to add?
Well, first I would say that we still have COP15 Part 2 to come. So although Part 1 took place in October last year, Part 2 is due to take place later this year. And it's a very important moment because 190 countries from around the world are due to agree on a new global biodiversity framework for the next 10 years and beyond. I think China has made a lot of progress on biodiversity conservation, and Professor Li has already mentioned some. And I think there's been, as well as the strengthening of environmental laws and ecological red line policy, which we've talked about, there's also the national park system, which has been launched, which is a wonderful way to protect and celebrate China's most important natural heritage. So the first 5 national parks were announced by President Xi last October. There's also been a ban on coastal wetland reclamation in the Yellow Sea, and the nomination of many of these important coastal wetlands to become World Heritage Sites. And I think perhaps more importantly, there's been this explosion of interest in nature across the country. So I'm someone that's interested in birds and bird watching. And I know that in 2000, for example, just over 20 years ago, there were only 3 birdwatching societies in China. Today, there are around 100. So there's been a huge increase in the interest in nature from particularly young people. And I see that as very encouraging. And of course, there's still a long way to go. All countries face a major challenge to ensure that their economies are in line with both the Paris Agreement on climate change and the new Kunming Agreement on biodiversity. So there's much work that still needs to be done. But I think it is important to recognize the progress that's been made over the last few years.
Okay, and another question, I would like to get more insights from both of you. So what can China and the UK learn from each other in terms of environmental protection and biodiversity conservation? And what are the potential collaboration areas between the two?
Yeah, I think absolutely international cooperation is fundamental in biodiversity. Nature doesn't recognize borders. Many of these birds that we talked about, migratory birds that we see in Beijing, they don't belong to one country. They might visit Russia, they might visit China, they might visit Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand. These are shared by all these countries, and so with that comes a shared responsibility to protect them. So I think that's a very important principle for biodiversity conservation, is international collaboration. And I think the UK, we have a strong history in wildlife conservation. We have some very world-leading, world-class organisations on environment protection. Our Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has more than 1.2 million members, with a network of nature reserves around the UK. We have the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, which is very, very good at wetland protection and restoration. And we host the Secretariat of BirdLife International, which is the biggest conservation partnership in the world. So we have a lot of expertise in the UK that I think can be useful to China. But then equally, I think it's very important to recognise that this collaboration should be two-way. And I think some of the areas where China has been innovative in terms of for example, the ecological red line policy, for example, some of the innovations that are happening in finance, in green finance and nature finance. I think these are areas that are really exciting and where China is actually leading the way. So I think there are areas that each country has strengths, and I think by working together we can ensure that both countries take advantage of the strengths of each other to build something that's even stronger than its parts.
那么李教授，您有没有什么可以增加的一些观点呢？
There's a lot that we can cooperate in this field. To just give you an example, the China-UK Clean Energy Partnership, which was signed in 2015. So China and the UK will partners in clean energy. So the two countries, they can work together in developing clean energies and also in the transfer of clean energy technologies. And we also designated a couple of cities to jointly research clean energy. The two countries also formed a climate change partnership in traditional industries, for example, nuclear, and also in some new energy fields like wind and solar power. We can work together. I believe our two countries should join hands together and contribute to the environmental protection of the world. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you so much for your insights, both of you. That was Professor Li Xiuxiang, a deputy to the National People's Congress, as well as Mr. Terry Townsend, a British conservationist and a fellow at the Paulson Institute. You are our guest today. Thank you so much for your time. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Face to Face. Here we discussed a lot of hot issues regarding environmental protection. Of course, those will also be top issues at this year's 2 sessions, the most important annual meeting on China's political agenda. Hope to talk to you soon. I'm Xia Cheng in Beijing. This is CGTN.